arrangements to show the.
Okay. Shalom b'chulam. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see everyone here. I know we're joined, as usual, by people from around the world, Israel, United States, and elsewhere. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, and this is the latest in our series of weekly Zoom events in English. Every Wednesday at around this time or a little later, we've been speaking to, or I've been speaking to, various figures from the world of Israeli politics and media and academia and diplomacy about various aspects of Israeli policy and Israeli history and all the things that interest the people that attend events here at the Begin Center. And obviously with the magic of Zoom, we can welcome people from around the world, not just Israel and Jerusalem. This is the third installment in a series that we've been doing on Israel's growing, developing ties with countries in Asia. I hope those of you on this call have saw the previous two meetings, the previous two discussions. If not, you can find them recorded on YouTube on the Begin Center YouTube channel, or you can email me, paulg@begincenter.org.il, and I'll send you the links to those. Okay, today we're going to be discussing South Korea, Israel's relations with South Korea, and we are extremely honored and privileged to have with us His Excellency, the Ambassador of Israel to the Republic of Korea, Akiva Tor. Akiva is originally from Fort Jackson, South Carolina. He received his BA in analytical philosophy from Columbia before making Aliyah, serving as a paratrooper in the IDF, a position in which he went on to serve in the reserves until 2008, reaching the rank of infantry captain. He continued his education in Israel, getting an MA in political science and contemporary Jewish thought from Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and then an MPA from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. In 2003, he began his diplomatic career as director of Israel's Economic and Cultural Office in Taipei. He's also served as deputy spokesman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, deputy director of the Department for Palestinian Affairs, and World Jewish Affairs advisor to the President of Israel. He was previously Israel's Consul General in San Francisco and was head of the MFA's Bureau for World Jewish Affairs and World Religions before his appointment as ambassador in Seoul at the beginning of this year. Akiva Tor, ambassador, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Indeed, I was born in South Carolina, but I grew up in Cleveland, and I wouldn't want fellow Clevelanders to think that I was denying my background.
Okay. That's important. Okay, sorry. So any Clevelanders out there, you have an adopted son on the call. First of all, let me say, the first thing I should say is a big thank you for joining us at what is 1 o'clock in the morning for you. So I'm assuming that's a strong coffee that you've got in front of you.
It's an herbal tea.
Oh, wow. Okay. Fine. You're more health conscious than some of us. Okay. Let's start with a general question. And just for those of you on the call that aren't familiar with how we do this, I'm going to have a conversation with our guests for about half an hour, and then you can all ask your questions on the chat facility, writing in the chat facility at the bottom of your screens, and we'll get to your questions afterwards. So a general question first, Mr. Ambassador. What are Israel's interests in Korea? We know there's been some news headlines about a historic free trade agreement between the two countries. Are the interests purely economic? I wonder also, just looking at it from the outside and not familiar with the smaller details, Obviously, we're all aware of South Korea in relation to North Korea and the hostility between those two countries, and maybe with a hostile neighbor to their north, is there some element of a security cooperation as well? Can you tell us something about the nature of the ties and what the aims are of the embassy? What does the work plan for the embassy look like?
Okay, well, first of all, just for nomenclature terms, indeed, Republic of Korea is called South Korea, but usually here in Korea, we just call it Korea.
Okay.
It's not an ideological statement about the non-existence of the Democratic People's Republic, which obviously exists and is a UN member, but generally we could just call Korea, Korea. Israel's interests in Korea are many, but they certainly start with the economic sphere, because Korea, on the one hand, it's a country of 52 million people on the opposite end of Asia from Israel. So it's a populous country and a large country, but it's not the most populous country. But on the other hand, in terms of world economies, it's one of the top 10 or one of the top 9. And it's an increasingly important place for Israel to engage in economically. But to engage with Korea economically requires also a deep political engagement. It's an Asian society here, an East Asian society. And while it's a free economy and conglomerates are free to do as they please, there's great importance to political symbols and pointing by the political leadership. So in pursuing a relationship with Korea, I have an economic work plan and I have a political work plan, but the reality is that they're quite similar. In other words, they're very much joined. What that means, for example, is if the president of Korea will visit Israel in an official state visit, then trade and investment from Korea and Israel will go up. That's clear and certain. And if that doesn't happen, then there's a high likelihood that things will remain static. So our interests are economic, but our work is also very political. We also have a strong defense relationship with Korea. In terms of trading partners, just in the military sphere, Korea is Israel's 8th most important customer for defense industries. And it's very obvious why. We're two democracies that have a very, very serious security dilemma. Other than Taiwan, we're maybe one of the few countries in the world that is in this situation. Korea and Israel are also probably the only two countries in the world which are facing a very severe missile threat and have to develop technologies which don't yet exist in order to defend against them. So there's a lot of room for very strong cooperation between us, not least because the Korean defense budget is larger than the Israeli defense budget. The annual acquisitions of the Korean Defense Ministry alone are $11 billion every year annually. So that's a huge amount, and that's a huge potential for Israel, both in terms of cooperation, in terms of us buying from them and them buying from us. And finally, because this country is really, Korea is developing at a huge clip, we engage with it like we engage with Japan, and almost in the same way that we engage with countries in Western Europe. And that is that we have a strong public diplomacy program. Just this evening, I was at a performance of the Kibbutz Contemporary Dance Company appearing in the Seoul International Dance Festival. And by the way, they were brilliant. And on Sunday, David Grossman appeared at the Seoul International Writers Festival. So this is a real happening place, and it behooves us to be very much engaged in it.
Wow. And in terms of the economics, as I mentioned the free trade agreement. What's the significance of that? Because my understanding is that it's not that it's actually quite historic in terms of it being the first such agreement that Israel signed with a country in East Asia. Is that right?
Actually, it's the first agreement that Israel has signed with any country in Asia, period.
Wow.
And therefore, it's very important for our foreign ministry because we're hoping that signing the free trade agreement with Korea will lead to similar free trade agreements with Japan and with other countries of similar or even larger economies.
Hmm.
But also for Korea, it's the first free trade agreement that they've signed with any country in the Middle East. And Korea is a country where the political and economic leadership is historically risk averse. They see themselves very much as a mercantile country. And therefore, trade with Israel is dwarfed by trade with the countries of the Arabian Peninsula. And any sense uh, that there's any remnants of an Arab boycott left, or that trade with Israel will somehow affect huge infrastructure projects in Saudi Arabia, for example, would normally immediately bring about a shutdown or great shyness on the Korean side from involvement in Israel.
Mm.
The fact that they've agreed to this free trade agreement and that we've signed it and that it should be entering into law within the next 2 months. The fact that they've done that shows that Korea finally understands that it's not a zero-sum game and that it's possible to work with Israel without problems alongside the Arab countries. So in that sense, it's very, very important. The free trade agreement itself is an agreement of about 150 pages. And what it primarily does is that it abolishes 95% of taxes and excise revenues on mutual trade between us, which actually will benefit the Israeli consumer more than the Korean consumer because Israel is importing cars, telephones, and semiconductors from Korea, and Korea is primarily importing Israeli innovation. So once a free trade agreement goes into effect, Korean cars should become cheaper in Israel by a factor of about 8%, unless the car dealers in Israel find a way to hoodwink everyone and to hide that, but hopefully that won't happen.
I just bought a Hyundai. I wish I should have waited.
Okay. The other thing the free trade agreement does is it does all kinds of things that are already happening but are not happening properly, such as protection of intellectual property, and it puts in place all kinds of mechanisms. But truth be told, the real importance of the FTA is in its symbolism. And a lot of attention is paid to it in Korea as well as in Israel. And again, it's a signaling. In other words, Samsung right now has an R&D center in Ramat Gan with 400 engineers. We want it to be 800 engineers. LG and SK all have, they're seeking out Israeli innovation, but they're not yet invested in the Israeli economy at the same level as Japan, for example. Hyundai does not yet have a research and development center in Israel, even though they should. They have a whole center which is looking for Israeli innovation, but if they want to build an autonomous car, they're going to have to be much more engaged in what's going on in Israel. So all these things are the FTA, and everything that we can do in this direction is aimed at trying to make this engagement even deeper.
So from South Korea's point of view, because obviously they're this huge global manufacturing hub. Their interest in Israel is in Israel. What Israel brings to the table is the innovation, right? The high tech and.
That's correct. The Korean and Israeli economies are not competitive. They do different things. They're synergistic. In other words, Korea as a country, they're manufacturing geniuses. Their level of technological expertise is extremely high. Earlier this week, I visited Posttech, which is it's one of the Korean technions in the south of the country. They have two atomic particle accelerators, and they're doing things at a very, very high level, but they've never won a Nobel Prize, and they're aware of that. And they're trying to figure out, well, sometimes they get confused between Israelis and Jews, but they're trying to figure out why the Israelis and the Jews have so many Nobels and what they can do about it. But what it actually means is that Israel is innovative. Korea is technologically advanced, but they're primarily a manufacturing base and a marketing base. And that's, of course, a perfect recipe for us to work together. But we need catalyzing elements in order to make it work, because it's not always a natural fit. We're actually quite far distant. Even when we had direct flights, it was still an 11-hour flight from Ben Gurion to Seoul Incheon Airport. And right now, without the direct flights, it's quite a hike. So we have to work hard to make this happen. The other thing that we have going for us in Korea is that a third of the population is Christian, and they're Christian. In other words, there's a minority of Catholics, but there's Presbyterians and Methodists the way they were in the United States in the 1950s. In other words, very conservative, very interested in Israel, very much believers in the Bible. And so I find myself in Korea. I've been given a Far Eastern Broadcasting Corporation. It's the largest Korean evangelical radio station. I have a weekly radio show. Wow. Bible study with the Israeli ambassador. Of course, everything's translated into Korean, so it's a little bit clunky. But this is also an important element for deepening our relationship, and also for deepening tourism between the two countries. That's something that we have in Korea that we don't have in any other country in Asia, other than perhaps the Philippines.
Well, you mentioned just in passing there that sometimes they don't make the distinction between Israelis and Jews. And there's a comment actually both from one of our listeners, Rosalie here, which I'm going to just jump on the back of now, where she mentions about Seoul University having a Talmud department. That's fascinating, and I was somewhat aware of that. But how do they view Jews generally? Because one of the questions, actually, a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking to the deputy ambassador in India, and I asked her about what it was like being in a country, because she was previously in London, a diplomatic posting in London. I was saying, it's so different being in a country not in Europe that doesn't have that long historic relationship with Jews, for better and worse, of course. And how different is that? And for you grew up in the United States, and you also had diplomatic posting in San Francisco. How different is it being in a country that has such a lack of engagement with actual Jews, although interestingly, this intellectual engagement with a Jewish historical source?
Okay, so Rosalie, Seoul National does not actually have a Talmud department.
How disappointing.
Yeah, they don't have a Talmud department. Unfortunately, they don't have a Hebrew department either. We're working on that. But there is this, Koreans talk about Talmud, but it's a whole story that we can get to. Rabbi Marvin Toker, who lives in Israel today, he wrote a book about the Talmud when he was an army chaplain in Korea in the early 60s. And it was reprinted, and so that and many Koreans read it. So, but it's primarily Agarita. But in any case, they have this idea about Talmud, but they don't really always know what Talmud is. Going back to Jewish life, India is like Muncie compared to Seoul. Korea really doesn't have any Jews. It's odd. I had a meeting today with the mayor of Seoul. Seoul is, the mayor of Seoul. That's a mayor of a city of 9 million residents and a metropolitan population of 25 million. So,
wow.
And I said to the mayor, I said, Mayor, you don't have any Jews here. And we have to do something in order that there be a Jewish community here. It doesn't make sense that Tokyo and Shanghai and even Taipei have significant Jewish populations, and we don't have it in Korea, which is kind of strange. For example, there is not a synagogue in Seoul, which is very odd. There is a Chabad house, Rabbi Osher Litzman, and he's working very, very hard to promote Jewish life here. But we don't have, the Jews who come here, it's very transient. It's Israelis or American or European Jews who are passing through for business, but we don't actually have a population. I think there used to be in the past when the American base was in Seoul, but it's moved out. And there's not actually a lot of American Jewish personnel here either. So it's really a country where there's very little Yiddishkeit. At the personal level, it's difficult. I also had to figure out what are my political levers. If I'm having trouble getting meetings at the top level, or if I had problems in San Francisco, so I would call people who knew Nancy Pelosi in the Jewish community, and I would get what I needed. But I don't have any Jewish friends of President Moon here. So I make friends with the Christians because it's the next best thing. And but it's hard. I definitely miss Jewish life here. So the Chabad house is actually a 4-minute walk from the Israeli ambassador's residence, and that's nice.
Is the Chabad house basically just serving? It's there to service visitors, from like Jewish visitors, Jewish tourists?
Look, there are a couple of people who have been. There are a number of Jews who have been here for 25 years, but there are strange people who somehow got stuck here. It's not like there's no Jewish school.
Right.
There's no Jewish Sunday school. It's a complicated. There was a minyan for Yom Kippur here in Seoul, but that was it. During Shabbat there isn't. So there's not enough Jewish life, and there should be more Jewish life. And I'm trying to work on that. I think it's part of my job as an ambassador to try to help the Chabad rabbi put in place a Jewish infrastructure so that Jewish life could begin to grow here a little bit. And I said to the mayor, it's very important that there be easily available kosher food here, or a place for Jews to be able to daven, just so that your metropolis, should be the way it should be. And the truth is that he understood intuitively what I was talking about, and I'll be working with his staff on that.
That's very interesting. I mean, one aspect, of course, about there not being Jews and not being any kind of historic relationship with Jews is that there's also not a history of anti-Semitism. I mean, that's not always the case, of course. Some countries have managed to have anti-Semitism without Jews, but there's not. I'm thinking, when you were in San Francisco, perhaps particularly in that part of the United States, part of your job would have been dealing with the anti-Israel, anti-Zionism stuff, the Israel apartheid weeks, all these kinds of things. And that, I presume, is entirely absent in South Korea, or am I wrong?
Well, what we have is we have the same thing that we have that I served in Taiwan in the mid-90s. And then I remember there was a problem. There was the Taiwan Economic Times, it was called. In any case, it was a Chinese language newspaper, and the editor was a Harvard educated economist. And he started, the newspaper was covering, they had a 3-part series on the protocols of the elders of Zion. So I went to the editor and I said, listen, you can't, why are you printing this stuff? This is a czarist forgery. You know that. He said, listen, you're correct, of course. And if you want, we'll stop it. But are you sure you want me to not print this? Because our readers think that they're reading something very pro-Jewish. It says that Jews love money. That's great. Jews, control the media and they control the American government. What could be better? That's just all the power to them. Well, you have these attitudes here as well. And, I sometimes, I've, even with very educated people or people at a very high level, they can say things and your mouth drops. I do correct them, but I don't seek out to correct them too much because they don't mean badly. It's a philo-Semitic anti-Semitism mostly.
Yeah.
It's true that we don't have a BDS problem. I mean, in San Francisco, we had, when the Israel Philharmonic came to appear in San Francisco, we always had this problem with protesters, always worried about someone jumping up with a sign in the middle of the protest. The politics of the Bay Area, you don't have that here. It's really entirely absent. Israel is a very, very strong brand here, and we don't have that problem. Although during the fighting in Gaza in May, we had protests outside the embassy every day, but they were small. And I did receive a letter from 150 civil rights, civil society NGOs in Korea, complaining about the Israeli activities and the Israeli apartheid. And my staff said, ignore it. It's not important. But I didn't do that. We wrote a letter, which we translated into Korean, and we answered them. I published an op-ed in the Korean version of Haaretz, and they published it. So I think that there is an intellectual left here, and it's connected somewhat to progressivism in the U.S. and elsewhere, but it's relatively small. And Korea, in its politics, even there's something quite parochial here. It reminds me of Israel. We're both countries that look at our belly buttons. Koreans are all the time thinking about their situation with North Korea, and it's actually extremely interesting. There are attitudes and positions here that I hadn't thought of, and I wasn't at all aware of before I got here, and we can talk about it a little bit if you'd like. There are attitudes towards the United States which are complicated. There are also, I thought that I was going to find myself in a country which is completely pro-American. It's not the case. They think about their issues with China, and they are constantly talking about their historical arguments with Japan. And this is really like 90% of the Korean international relations dialogue. And so there's the rest, they know that there's something going on in the Middle East, just like we know that there's something going on with the Japanese releasing water that irradiated water in Fukushima. We know about it, and it's somewhere in our brain cells, but we don't really think about it that much. That's their relationship to our issues.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I guess we're both of us, both countries so far away from each other, are both in these parts of the world that are so geopolitically complicated, and I guess we can't expect them to be worrying about Iran when they've got Kim Jong-un sitting.
Well, they're actually. We do have a complaint regarding. Korea has warm relations with Iran. They have an embassy in Tehran. They're holding. Well, most of the countries of the world have embassies in Tehran. Believe it or not.
Yeah.
But the Koreans, like I said earlier, they're very much a mercantile nation. They look at Iran and what do they see? They see a country which is under sanctions. They see a country which Korean banks are holding between $7 and $12 billion of Iranian funds, but they're not being released because of U.S. Treasury Department regulations. But ultimately, when the Koreans look at Iran, they don't feel animus. They see a possible market of 85 million people, and they see also an energy producer which can sell them oil. So they're thinking about it very pragmatically, but sometimes they do things which, as Israeli ambassador, it does get us upset. For example, the inauguration of Raisi in Tehran, North Korea, Japan, and China were represented by their ambassadors in Tehran. Korea sent their vice foreign minister.
Wow.
So,
wow.
European Union was also represented at high diplomatic level as well. So they weren't alone.
Story for an yes. That's a whole other discussion. Yeah, I mean, so I'm just going to ask like another question or two, and I want people to start writing questions in the chat. We have one, but I want people to get typing away. I mean, I think of, obviously, Iran, as you said, they have good relations with Iran, warm relations with Iran. At the same time, Iran is when I think of sort of global geopolitics, I tend to think of Iran as being, in that same basket of kind of troublemaking authoritarian states, along with North Korea and Syria. And these are countries that I mean, China is a whole other question because it's a superpower. But these are countries that do have relations with each other. And Syria's nuclear reactor, which we bombed a few years ago, was provided by the North Koreans.
That's correct.
And I mean, a South Korea, and by which I mean both the government and the sort of chattering classes, are they aware that North Korea, their big enemy, their sort of existential threat, is intimately connected with our enemies?
I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I said warm relations with Iran. That was really, I think, an overstatement. It'd be more correct to say good relations.
Okay, good relations.
Because after all, the Iranians kidnapped one of their ships in July, and they weren't so happy about that.
Right.
Yes, they are aware of possibilities of a cooperation between Iran and Korea and North Korea on issues of missile technology, perhaps also in the nuclear field. And they certainly know there's historic relations between North Korea and Syria. I don't know that South Korea has an embassy in Damascus. I don't think so. But they are aware of this. But there's something in the premise of your question which is not 100% correct. The current government in South Korea would not say that North Korea is their enemy. They wouldn't say that. They would say that North Korea is the other regime on the peninsula, the other half of the Korean people, and that it's necessary to engage with them, perhaps to send humanitarian assistance.
Wow.
And to find every avenue for dialogue in order to first move to an end of war declaration. The Korean War ended with an armistice, which Republic of Korea didn't sign, by the way. It was signed by the U.S. and UN forces. So they want to get to a formal end of war agreement, and then they would like to, do people to people kind of things. The political divide in Korea is between left and right, or center left and center right. Right now, the center left is in power. There'll be presidential elections next March. And the central left, they believe in the Republic of Korea Army, Air Force, and Navy, and the need to maintain military deterrence. But I think that they would be very hesitant to define North Korea as their enemy.
Interesting. So it's right. So would it be fair to say that the left-right divide in North Korea, rather like Israel, is not a economic left-right divide, but is more in terms of how you think about peace and security, in the same way that we tend to talk about left and right.
It is actually here in. I think that the left-right divide in Korea is more similar to the Democrat-Republican divide in the United States before the current polarization.
Right, right.
In other words, the right in Korea, they call themselves conservatives. Maybe they're also similar to the conservatives in the UK. They're fiscally more conservative. They're more pro-business. They want to lower taxation.
Smaller government, yeah.
They're more laissez-faire about the problem of housing. And the left is more concerned about social welfare, more friendly with the labor unions, more concerned about, well, actually all governments here have to worry about housing prices, because if we think housing is expensive in Israel and in Korea, it's truly something beyond the imagination. An average small apartment in metropolitan Seoul, it's between $900,000 and $1 million, not shekels, dollars. So it's unbelievably expensive. It's unbelievably expensive. And it's a problem. Korea also has another problem. They have negative childbirth. Right. Lowest rate of population growth in the OECD.
Really?
Yeah, and that's a sign of pessimism. And the government is very concerned about that, both of the right and the left. They don't really know what to do about it. So anyway, the political divide is also economic. Economic and internal. Everything also has to do with, even though the right and the left are both pro-democracy and believe in the democratic regime, the right is slightly tainted by, as you know, being a little bit closer to the former military dictatorship.
Right.
Because, for example, one of the presidents of the Conservative Party, Mrs. Park, who's now in jail. Some things remind me of Israel a little bit. They have quite a few presidents who are in jail, but her father was the original Park who launched a coup d'état.
Right. The general, right?
Right. That's right. General Park in 1962, I believe. Yeah. So that's and whereas the left is more connected to the student movement and the student protests in the south of Korea. So that, by the way, reminds me a little bit of Israel. This business about Mapai, Likud.
Yeah, that's what I
except it's inverted. It's inverted. The conservatives are Mapai. So
right. That's interesting. No, I was thinking, because when you were talking about the current government, the current left-wing government, or center-left government, doesn't think of, would be hesitant to regard the North Koreans as the enemy, but rather as sort of partners in some sort of tentative process. It reminds me of Israel in the days of negotiations with the PA, with the PLO. That you had one side. One side was still very clear that these guys were the enemy, and the other side was saying, actually, we're now talking about them in terms of being partners. I wouldn't push it too far, because obviously I wouldn't do the analogy too far.
Here's an interesting thing. There's both left and right in Korea is of the political class is concerned when they hear that young people are apathetic about the idea of ultimate unification of the Korean Peninsula and don't really care about it that much.
Interesting.
I frankly don't so much believe in those studies, because I think that if unification ever became a possibility, in other words, if Kim Jong-un would all of a sudden become Gorbachev or something like that, I think that the excitement here would go through the roof.
Yeah.
I asked my staff, my Korean staff, I asked them how many of them dream sometimes about, walking around the geography of North Korea. And the majority said that they dream about it.
Hmm.
which means that they do think about, they do have this hope that ultimately the Korean Peninsula will be reunited.
Right.
If
Yeah, I
if
mean,
uh, if the Korean Peninsula would be reunited, uh, then the territory of North Korea is a third larger than South Korea,
oh, really?
while its population is about half. Korea would become close to the size of Japan.
Although the economic challenge would make the unification of Germany look like a cakewalk, because the levels, the difference in wealth and
Yeah,
everything and development in between the two countries would be much greater than, say, East and West Germany even, and it would be something else.
That's what people say. That's what people say. I don't know how correct it is. It's true. North Korea is much poorer than communist East Germany. That's true, but it's very rich in minerals.
Huh.
It has ores, and it has all kinds of sources, and it has a manufacturing base which is not modern and needs to be modernized. But
Interesting.
Korea has enough money. South Korea has enough money to develop the North, but it's quite far away, and I don't know when this will happen.
Yeah. Right. That's yeah. It's unlikely to happen during your tenure.
It's unlikely to happen during my tenure. That's correct. But in 1985, no one predicted perestroika in the Soviet Union, which happened
True.
in 1991. So
True. Very true. Okay, let's get to some questions from our audience here. So Sveberg says that you mentioned a Korean version of Haaretz, and he wondered if there are Korean versions of other newspapers or media. Maybe just a general question about the media in Korea. How does it relate to, or how is it similar to Israeli or Western media in its diversity?
There's a huge media scene here. They have a lot of newspapers. They have a lot of radio stations and television news, and less radio. I mean, they have radio, but a little bit less. I think actually, I always feel bad. I always feel like Israeli press is, too politicized. And then I got to Korea, where I really see what a politicized press is. I mean, you have television stations where the head of the television station is a presidential appointee, not a professional appointee, presidential appointee.
Wow.
So there's papers are clearly aligned either with the right or the left. Most of the newspapers are more conservative. It's like a television station, so they have a clear political flavor. One thing though is interesting. It's a biting press, and the politicians are extremely afraid of the journalists. They're so afraid of getting caught or gotcha things. It causes them to be very risk averse, even more than in Israel, or much more than in Israel.
Interesting.
Which I think is kind of unfortunate.
There's a question. Chia Samson asked about Israeli tourism. I mean, I guess now is not the best time to be asking that, but let's say pre-corona, pre-COVID, was there significant tourism to Korea, and perhaps the other way around? The other way
around, certainly. We were up to 62,000 Korean pilgrims a year, which was astronomical growth. It had grown from 25,000 just 4 or 5 years. We had direct flights of Korean Air 3 times a week, which was about to go up to 4. So that was growing at quite a clip, and I think that will return actually. Tourism from Israel to Korea is much less. It's most of the Israelis who are visiting here are usually for business reasons. Korea, I think there's a reason for it. I mean, Korea is very pretty, but if you're going to go either to Japan or to Korea or Vietnam, people who want something rougher and cheaper will go to Vietnam, and people who want something more beautiful and more pristine will go to Tokyo. But on the other hand, there are a lot of. I think Korea is very interesting and kind of a fascinating place.
Right. Yeah. Charlotte says that she's surprised to hear you say that South Korea does not see North Korea as an enemy. They are still formally at war. She writes, "We see North Korea as dangerous, terrible for its citizens with nuclear power." I mean, I guess I kind of take two questions from that. One is, can you say a little more about why, like, what's the rationale for thinking of North Korea in this more sort of hopeful way, perhaps? And also, do the South Koreans look at North Korea and sort of think, wow, these are like, we're the same people. We're all Koreans, and these guys, they're suffering terribly under this totalitarian system. Is there that sense of sort of sympathy, empathy with ordinary North Koreans? So it's two questions, really. It's that one and
first of all,
rationalizing.
The issue about how to deal with the regime in Pyongyang is part of the political debate in Korea between right and left, where the left is more willing to say, well, we have to try to understand Kim, and we have to understand the limits of what he can do and what he can't do, and to understand that there's a whole governmental apparatus in North Korea which constricts what he's able to do, and we have to try to work with him within his frameworks. On the right, their much stronger tendency will be we cannot trust these people. What they're trying to do is to extract concessions through salami tactics, and to be much more in favor of a hard line. But both sides of the political divide in South Korea recognize that North Korea are part of the Korean people. They speak the Korean language, and you can't get away from that. The other point is that it's true that there's only an armistice agreement and not an end of war, but the war ended in 1953, which was before I was born, before you were born, Paul. And aside from isolated terrorist incidents and infiltrations, which stopped in the 1970s. It's at the same time that we had Fatah infiltrations in the Eretz Dafim and the Bika. Since then, it's been a quiet border.
Right.
So essentially, there hasn't been bloodshed. Well, it's not 100% correct. There have been a number of incidents. There's an incident of a sinking of a Korean frigate in 2010, and 41 sailors were killed, right. But which is a very, very extreme incident. But for the most part, there's no fighting. There's no incidents in the DMZ. DMZ is extreme. The demilitarized zone is completely quiet. And I think it also it affects the South Korean readiness. In other words, they have a huge defense budget, and they have a universal draft of all males, but they have a problem with motivation in the way that we don't have. And I think that comes from a feeling of young people that this war it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
So
that's it. That's really interesting. That's an interesting comparison. I think,
Also consider the fact that many South Koreans have at some point visited Pyongyang, not in huge numbers.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but in other words, it's not a situation of like, can an Israeli visit Damascus? It's there have been, South Korean government officials who visit there, or academics who have visited there.
Okay, I'm aware of the
There
time.
was also, by the way, in the Winter Olympics, there was a united women's hockey team.
Oh yeah, right.
They had a big problem because South Korea the a lot of the women's hockey players were Korean Americans, and they kept saying pass, pass for pass the puck.
Oh,
The
wow.
North Koreans didn't understand that.
Oh, wow. um, I'm aware of the time, and I want to allow you to get to bed at a reasonable hour. So there are two questions here which are actually quite nicely connected. Svi asks whether, with Korean politicians wary of the media, is Korea relatively corruption free? But then Virginia asks, unconnected to Svi, I assume, after viewing many Korean shows, it appears there is a bloated bureaucracy and police and legal corruption that people seem to accept. Is that true, or is she watching shows that are a little flexible with it?
No, there is a big problem there. No, of course there's corruption. But on the other hand, it's a state with the rule of law and a very strong prosecution service. And again, a media which is sticking its nose everywhere, even though there's political flavor to the different things, but they're hounding all the politicians on the right and left, and the politicians are scared of the media, of them uncovering things. And the Korean public is not apathetic to corruption. They care about it. And when there are stories of corruption, it's first of all, there's quite a lot of politicians are in jail, but it's right now, for example, the presidential candidate of the left, Lee Jae-myung, he's got a problem because he, as mayor 10 years ago, he was involved in a real estate development, and it's not clear that he did anything that was corrupt, but there's a taint of corruption of some of the things that happened there, and it's really, really harming him in the polls. So I think there is corruption here, but I don't feel corruption. I feel that it's a lawful state, and that I don't think like you have problems like you have in China. I think that things are really law driven. They do have a big argument internally regarding the strength of the prosecution, which is a little bit reminiscent of some of the arguments in Israel, where there are some people who think that the prosecution is far too strong and believe that the prosecution hounding of candidates of this party or not are politically motivated.
Interesting. Oh yeah, that's a very another analogy with situations here. Yeah, I mean, as you said, a former president is in prison. So I mean, it's
more than one.
So that's okay.
Actually two.
Okay, so that certainly speaks to a robust.
No, the country is it's a country where you want to engage with it. It's a very serious country. They take themselves seriously. They care about Korea. They love their country, and there. By the way, there are many parallels. Even though they're so different to us, there are many parallels. Both Israel and Korea were both founded in 1948. They're both very poor. They're both pretty much without any natural resources, and they both went through a process of strong economic growth in the late 70s and during the 80s. And although I think that Korea had a rougher time, they went through a rougher period of industrialization, but there's a lot of things which are, they have a lot of pride in their accomplishments in the same way that Israel has a lot of pride in its accomplishments.
Okay. So one last question, and then I'll let you go.
And we are commemorating in 2022 60 years of diplomatic relations between Israel and Korea. Just had a logo contest together with the Korean embassy in Israel. We chose a logo.
Great. Good one. Very nice. Very nice. So is that going to be marked in some way, the 60th anniversary? There's going to be some...
We've got a whole work plan. We're doing a huge amount where we're working on, we have a whole work plan with academic conferences, business trips. We're erecting a metaverse, which is devoted to the relationship. We're working with a K-pop producer to produce a music video of with Israeli and Korean artists.
Wow.
We're doing a lot. We're doing a lot.
Amazing. So let's finish just with this this question about Corona. There was a story about a vaccination swap, Israel and South Korea. What was that? Can you speak to that? What was that about? How did that turn out? What was the motivation behind that?
Well, in July, Israel had we had 700,000 Pfizer vaccines that we didn't need, and they were about to expire on July 31st. Palestinian Authority did not want them, and we were seeking a country that would be able to take them from us safely and use them before the end of July 31st and return to us vaccines at a later date. And we looked for a partner. Initially, there was a negotiation with the United Kingdom, which didn't work out. And I was called by the foreign ministry and said, what about Korea? And I spoke to the KDCA, which is the Korea Disease Control Agency. And we worked it out. We worked it out in less than a week. Wow. And then there was a secondary swap of 81,000. So during July, Israel basically transferred to Korea 781,000 Pfizer doses, and we were receiving them back last week of October, November, and December, according to our time schedule. I loved doing this because my partners on the Korean side were unbelievably professional, and my partners on the Israeli side in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Health were equally devoted. We carried this out through Shabbat. The second phase, when I was told about 81,000 doses, from the time that I received the information from Israel to its being loaded on a plane for Korea, passed 48 hours.
Wow.
Now, to do that with all of the contractual needs and the financial obligations and what it means in terms of trust between both countries for cold chain transmission, it's something which, by the way, only Israel and Korea did it. It wasn't, there were swaps within the European Union, but between countries, there were very few swaps. But we were able to do it with them because they're at an equal professional level to us in terms of handling these things.
Right.
And once we brought the two ministries of health into connection, it went very quickly. So it was perfect. It was really a demonstration of how to run the international vaccine economy. Okay. Other than taking care of the poor countries. In other words, how the wealthy countries
right. That's
can run
a different
the
topic. Yeah,
economy.
Indeed. That may come back to bite us all at some point. Okay. Ambassador Akiva Tor, thank you very, very much for giving us your time, especially at this late hour. It's really been very enlightening and educational. I'm pretty sure that most of us, if not all of us, certainly I speak for myself, did not know an awful lot about either South Korea or the nature of its relationship and the importance of its relationship with Israel. So thank you so much. And I think we should all be very gratified that Israel has such a wonderful diplomat representing the country in South Korea. And Yishar Koach, and we wish you a successful rest of your tenure. And thank you again.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Begin Center, and thank you all of the listeners.
Okay, just to everyone there, just to everyone on the list, I wrote in my email address for those that are not on my mailing list, paulg@begincenter.org.il, if you want to get notified of all the events we have in English and the weekly events that I'm hosting and other things, then email me and I'll make sure you get those regular emails. So thank you, everyone. Good night to Ambassador Akiva Tor. Good evening, good day good afternoon to everyone else, depending on where they are. And I hope to see you next week for the final part of this series when we're going to be talking about